Millionaire pretends to be homeless and the receptionist pays for his stay. What he did the next day changed her life forever. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows of the Dream Inn, a modest establishment located on the outskirts of Chicago. Helen Walker, 28, adjusted her name badge on her navy blue uniform as she watched raindrops slide down the front window of the lobby. It was 11:45 p.m. and her night shift had just begun. A graduate in hospitality management, Helen never imagined she would be working at a mid-scale hotel after all the hard work she'd put into her studies. But an economic downturn and the need to help her family had steered her life far from the dream she once held. Still, she maintained a genuine smile and provided impeccable service that made her a favorite among regular guests. The hotel's decor was simple: pastel-colored walls, a few artificial potted plants, and a warm, albeit slightly outdated lighting scheme. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, something Helen insisted on serving throughout the night, gave the lobby an extra touch of comfort. While she was organizing the next day's reservations on the computer system, her delicate fingers danced over the keyboard. Her mind wandered between the bills that needed to be paid and the dream of one day owning her own establishment. As a receptionist, her modest salary barely covered basic expenses, and tips were few and far between. A particularly loud clap of thunder made her jump in her chair. The storm was intensifying, and Helen silently thanked herself for having grabbed her umbrella, even though the weather had been clear when she left home. It was at that moment that the front door swung open, letting in a blast of icy wind along with a completely soaked man. The stranger wore worn-out clothes, a pair of faded jeans, a battered plaid shirt, and a threadbare jacket that had clearly seen better days. His stubbled face and unkempt hair would normally have raised concerns, yet something in his eyes caught Helen's attention immediately. "Good evening," she greeted him warmly, offering her characteristic smile as he approached the front desk, leaving a trail of water on the freshly waxed floor. "Good evening," he replied in a rough yet polite voice. I need a place to stay for the night," but his hands trembled as he tried to explain his situation. Despite his disheveled appearance, Helen noticed a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, a manner of speaking that didn't match his tattered attire. The man continued, "I lost my wallet today. I can't pay for a room, but I can't be out on the streets in this storm either." The hotel policy was clear: no prepayment, no room. Helen knew it well. She had memorized every line of the manual on her very first day. But something about his predicament touched her deeply. She recalled her father's story from years ago when he, too, had needed help from strangers after losing his job. Glancing quickly at the system, Helen noted that the Dream Inn was only 40% occupied and several rooms were empty. Her mind began to calculate. The cost of one night's stay was practically half of what she'd set aside to pay her mother's utility bill, but she could manage, perhaps by working extra hours over the weekend. "Sir," she began hesitantly. The man was already turning to leave, resigned to another rejection. "Please wait. I'll help you." Reaching beneath the desk, Helen retrieved the money she had earmarked for household bills. "I'll cover your stay for tonight," she said, surprised by her own decision. The man's eyes widened in a mixture of shock and gratitude. "I can't accept that," he murmured, but Helen was already filling out the registration form. "Please accept it. No one should be left out in a storm like this," she insisted as she entered the reservation details. "Room 304 on the 3rd floor. Breakfast is served from 6 u to 10 a.m. Handing him the room key, Helen felt an inexplicable sensation, as if this very moment was more significant than it appeared. The man took the key with trembling hands, repeatedly thanking her. "What's your name?" he asked before heading toward the elevator. "Helen Walker," she replied, readjusting her badge. "Thank you, Helen. Your kindness will not be forgotten," he said, his penetrating gaze searing the memory of that night into her heart. Watching him disappear down the hall, Helen tried to justify her impulsive decision. The money would be missed, but something inside her affirmed that she had done the right thing. Little did she know that that stormy night was about to mark the beginning of a transformation that would change her life forever. The next morning, The first rays of sun peeked through clouds lingering from the previous night's storm. Helen wrapped up her shift by organizing the final reports before the next receptionist took over. Her back ached after hours of sitting, and her mind was already drifting to the crowded subway awaiting her commute home. The sound of determined footsteps in the lobby caught her attention. Looking up, she blinked several times to make sure her tired eyes weren't playing tricks on her. A man in a sharply tailored Italian suit, polished leather shoes, and perfectly coiffed hair was approaching the desk. Carrying a genuine leather briefcase and sporting a watch that likely cost more than a year's salary, he exuded an air of power. But it was his face that made her heart skip a beat. It was the same man from the previous night. The transformation was so dramatic it seemed impossible, yet those eyes, they were unmistakable. "Good morning, Helen Walker," he said, smiling in a way that lit up his entire face. His once rough voice was now firm and exuded authority. Good morning," Helen stammered, feeling her cheeks warm. 1,000 questions raced through her mind, yet none found their way to her lips. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," he continued, setting his briefcase down on the counter. "My name is Richard Morgan, CEO of Future Tech Inc. and you, my dear, just passed the most important test of your life." Helen's legs nearly buckled as she sat down gratefully. Future Tech Inc. was one of the nation's largest technology companies, known for its innovative projects and investments in social causes. Richard Morgan, its founder, was notorious for his discretion and unconventional management methods. A test was all she could manage. Richard pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. "For the past 6 months, I've been visiting hotels in various cities across the country, always encountering the same look, always hearing the same story, testing people's humanity and their capacity for genuine compassion." He opened his briefcase and removed a state-of-the-art tablet. "Do you know how many people offered to help me during these months, Helen? Only 3. Just 3 out of more than 100 hotels I visited." Helen swallowed hard, still trying to process everything. Though her shift had ended 15 minutes ago, none of that mattered now. "What you did last night," Richard continued, "was not just an act of kindness. It was a demonstration of character, leadership, and a humanitarian vision. Exactly what I'm looking for in my new project." Sliding the tablet toward her, he displayed architectural renderings of a cutting-edge hotel. "This is the Welcome Project, a network of social hotels that will offer dignified accommodations for those in vulnerable situations. And I want you to be its chief executive officer." Helen felt as if the air had been knocked out of her. Her hands trembled as she examined the project images. It was grand, innovative, and looked like it had leaped straight from her most ambitious dreams. "But I'm just a receptionist," she protested, still in disbelief. Richard smiled, a smile that carried years of experience and wisdom. "You're much more than that, Helen. You're someone who, even while struggling financially, chose to help a stranger. Someone who treats every person with dignity, regardless of their appearance. And most importantly, someone with the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching." He rose, smoothing his impeccably tailored suit. "The pilot project needs to be up and running in 3 months. It will be an immense challenge, but something tells me you're exactly the person for it." "What do you say?" Helen glanced at her name badge, the peeling wallpaper of the Dream Inn, and the battered purse from which she had just pulled money to help a stranger. Her entire life flashed before her eyes, dreams that had once seemed impossible, countless, nights spent worrying over bills, all the effort to keep smiling through the hardest days. "Yes," she replied, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "I accept." Richard extended his hand for a formal shake, sealing that extraordinary moment. "Welcome to the Welcome Project, Executive Director Helen Walker. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., my driver will pick you up to take you to our headquarters. And don't worry about notifying your current management. I've already taken care of that." As he strode toward the door, Helen found it hard to believe what was happening. Her life had changed completely in less than 12 hours, all because of a decision made on a rainy night. A few weeks later, Helen's new life was in full swing. Future Tech Inc.'s headquarters towered in the heart of downtown Chicago, a gleaming glass skyscraper that Helen had once seen only in magazine spreads. Seated in the leather seat of the company car, a luxurious ride that still made her feel out of place, she adjusted her new blazer, the first piece of clothing she had purchased for her new life. Beatrice, Richard's elegant secretary, greeted her on the 30th floor with a warm smile. "Mr. Morgan is waiting for you in the main conference room," she informed, leading Helen along a corridor adorned with contemporary art. Inside, the conference room offered a panoramic view of the city. Richard was already there, accompanied by 4 other professionals who stood as she entered. "Helen, welcome to your new home," he said, gesturing for everyone to be seated. "Allow me to introduce your initial team." One by one, Richard presented the experts. Marina Brooks, a renowned architect celebrated for sustainable designs; Charles Edwards, a specialist in social project management; Deborah Stone, an attorney with expertise in humanitarian law; and Alexander Riley, an accountant with vast experience in the non-profit sector. "This is the team that will help you bring the Welcome Project to life," Richard explained. "You have 3 months to transform that vacant lot," he said, pointing out the window to a bare parcel a few blocks away, "into the nation's first social hotel." Helen felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, yet something inside her was changing. The timid receptionist was giving way to a determined leader. "Before we begin," she said, surprising everyone by taking initiative, "I'd like to understand what each of you envisions for this project. I don't just want to build a hotel. I want to create something that truly makes a difference in people's lives." Marina, the architect, was the first to smile. "Finally, someone who speaks my language," she said, opening a folder of ideas. "I have some concepts to make the space not only functional, but genuinely welcoming." The following hours were intense. Helen discovered that she had a natural talent for coordinating ideas and people. Her practical experience in the hospitality industry proved invaluable. She knew exactly which details needed attention. "We need the project to go beyond just providing lodging," Helen explained as she sketched a diagram on the whiteboard. "We must develop a professional training program for our guests. Many of them have potential. They just need an opportunity." Charles Edwards, the social project specialist, agreed enthusiastically. "We can form partnerships with local businesses to generate job opportunities, create a supportive network." Attorney Deborah Stone took rapid notes. "I'll prepare all the necessary legal documents for these partnerships. We also need to consider a sustainable legal framework for the project in the long run." It was Alexander, the accountant, who introduced the first real challenge. "Our budget covers construction and 3 months of operations. After that, we'll need to find ways to make the project self-sustaining." All eyes turned to Helen. It was her first real test as a leader. "And what if," she began, an idea forming in her mind, "we create a community garden on the roof? We could supply fresh produce for our restaurant and even sell the surplus to local businesses." Richard, who had been quietly observing, offered a discreet smile. Helen continued, her confidence growing. "We could also reserve some rooms for paying guests, people who want to support the project. This way, every commercial stay subsidizes several social stays." The room filled with positive energy. Ideas flowed from every corner, and Helen steered the discussion with a natural ease that even surprised her. After the meeting, Richard pulled Helen aside. "Impressive," he said. "You've exceeded all my expectations on your very first day." "Thank you for your trust," she replied. "But may I ask, why choose that particular hotel for your test?" Richard's gaze turned to the window, his expression growing serious. "Everything happens for a reason, Helen. In time, you'll understand." With those enigmatic words, he excused himself, leaving Helen with more questions than answers. Later that day, as Helen left the office, she found herself passing by the Dream Inn, the very place where it all began. The receptionist from that rainy night recognized her immediately. "Helen! What a wonderful surprise!" he exclaimed. "We heard about your success. You're an inspiration to all of us here." Sitting in the same spot where she had spent countless nights working, Helen gazed toward the door through which Richard had once entered on that stormy night. That one decision had changed her life. Now she faced another decision that could transform her life once again. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. Tomorrow we have an important meeting with potential investors. Your presence is essential. Helen looked at the clock. 36 hours to respond to an offer from Victoria Lancaster. 36 hours to choose between financial security and purpose. 36 hours to decide what kind of person she truly wanted to be. The conference room for the investors was set up meticulously. As usual, Helen arrived early to review her presentation one last time. Dark circles on her face betrayed the sleepless night spent torn between Victoria's proposition and the responsibilities of the project. As she arranged the folders on the table, an elegant notification appeared. Victoria Lancaster, CEO of Regal Hotels International, was waiting in the meeting room. The name made Helen choke on her coffee. Victoria Lancaster was the CEO of one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the world. What was she doing here at this hour? Inside the meeting room, Helen found a poised middle-aged woman dressed in an impeccable Chanel ensemble. "Miss Walker," Victoria said with a warm smile as she extended her perfectly manicured hand, "your reputation precedes you." "My reputation?" Helen asked, taken aback. "The hospitality market is smaller than it seems," Victoria replied, gesturing toward the chairs. "Your project has been attracting a lot of attention, transforming a receptionist into an executive director. Richard always had a knack for the unexpected." Helen fell silent, waiting for the real purpose of the visit. Victoria did not disappoint. "Let me be frank, Miss Walker. I'm here to offer you the position of Chief Operating Officer for Regal Hotels International for the Americas. An initial 7-figure salary, annual bonuses, stock options, and of course a fully furnished apartment in any city of your choice." A deafening silence followed. Helen's heart raced, but she maintained the composure she had honed over the past weeks. "Why me?" she finally asked. "There are executives with far more experience in the market." Victoria smiled, a smile that did little to warm her eyes. "Because you have something that no MBA can teach: instinct. In just a few weeks, you've turned a social project into something that's making the largest hotel chains rethink their business models." Helen peered out the window at the workers beginning their day on the construction site below, people who had believed in the project and had invested in the dream of making a difference. "The offer is tempting," Helen began carefully, "but I need time to think." "Of course," Victoria replied gracefully. "You have 48 hours. After that, I must proceed with another candidate." As she moved to leave, she paused and added, "Oh, and Helen, Richard doesn't need to know about this conversation, not yet." Once Victoria had gone, Helen sank into her chair, her mind awhirl with thoughts. The salary would solve all her family's financial problems. Her mother could finally retire, and her younger brother could attend the college he'd always dreamed of. Her phone buzzed. A message from Tony Foster at the Hope Institute, sharing photos of a group of young people who had enrolled in the professional training program. Their hopeful smiles tightened Helen's heart. For the rest of the day, Helen struggled to focus on her work. Victoria's proposition kept creeping into her thoughts. During a team meeting, Marina presented the final tweaks for the community garden project, and Charles reported progress on local business partnerships. "Helen, are you all right?" Deborah asked, noticing her distraction. "Yes, just deep in thought," Helen replied with a forced smile. At the end of the day, Helen did something she hadn't done since assuming her new role. She returned to the Dream Inn where it all began. The night receptionist recognized her immediately. "Helen, what a wonderful surprise," he cheered. "We heard about your success. You're an inspiration to everyone here." Sitting where she had once spent long, lonely nights at work, Helen gazed at the door through which Richard had entered on that rainy night. The decision she made then had altered her life irrevocably. Now, she was on the cusp of another decision that could change everything again. Her phone buzzed once more. A message from Richard. "Tomorrow we have an important meeting with investors. Your presence is crucial." Helen checked the time. 36 hours left to decide on Victoria Lancaster's offer. 36 hours to choose between financial security and living her purpose. 36 hours to determine what kind of person she truly wanted to be. The investor meeting proceeded smoothly. Helen's sustainable business model, which blended social impact with financial viability, impressed everyone. When one investor asked, "But what about the competition? Other hotel chains could easily replicate this model." Helen smiled and replied, "We're not just building a hotel, we're creating a movement. The more social hotels there are, the better it is for everyone." After the meeting, Richard invited Helen into his office. "I heard about the Regal Hotel's offer," he said, catching her off guard. "Victoria called me last night, asking for my blessing to hire you." Helen blushed. "I was going to mention it." "No explanation is necessary," Richard interrupted kindly. "Tough decisions are part of this journey. When I received my first multi-million-dollar offer, I too was tempted to abandon my social projects." "What made you turn it down?" Helen asked, curious. "Who said I turned it down?" Richard smiled wryly. "I accepted, and it turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. I spent 2 years in a job that paid well but drained my soul. Until one day, gazing out the window of my penthouse, I realized I had become exactly the kind of person I once fought against." A lump formed in Helen's throat. Richard continued, "That was when I created Future Tech Inc., with the mission of using technology for social transformation. Money became a consequence, not the goal." At that moment, her phone buzzed, a message from Victoria Lancaster demanding an answer. Helen looked at the screen, then at Richard, and finally out at the construction site where the social hotel was taking shape. "You know what's funny?" she said with a small smile. "Just 24 hours ago, this offer seemed like a dream come true. Now I realize I'm already living my true dream." Richard nodded, proud. "So what will your answer be to Victoria?" Helen picked up her phone, her fingers gliding over the screen with determination. Her response would be more than a simple refusal. It would be a declaration of her principles, a choice for a life of purpose. What she didn't know was that her decision would set off a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the entire American hospitality industry. In the early hours of a seemingly ordinary morning, as Helen supervised the installation of solar panels on the roof of the New Haven Hotel, Marina burst onto the terrace, tablet in hand. "Helen, we need to talk," Marina said, her normally calm face etched with worry. "We found something during the foundation excavation." At the spot Marina indicated, an old partially buried sign revealed a crucial detail. The lot had once belonged to the Hope Institute, a long-standing charitable organization that had operated in the neighborhood for decades. "How did we miss this earlier?" Helen asked, feeling a chill in her stomach. "The records were incomplete," explained Deborah, the attorney who had just arrived. "Apparently the Institute ceased operations 15 years ago, but there was never any formal transfer of ownership." News of the discovery spread quickly. By the end of the day, representatives from the old Hope Institute had appeared at Helen's office. Their leader, a distinguished gentleman in his late 60s named Anthony Foster, had a determined gleam in his eyes. "Miss Walker," he began, "the Hope Institute dedicated 50 years to helping those in need in this community. We cannot simply ignore that legacy." Taking a deep breath and remembering her mother's advice on handling difficult situations, Helen replied, "Mr. Foster, please tell me more about the Institute's work. I believe we can turn this apparent obstacle into an opportunity." For the next 2 hours, Anthony recounted moving stories of the Institute's past achievements. Helen listened intently, taking notes and realizing that this discovery might be no coincidence at all. "What if," Helen proposed after listening carefully, "we integrate the Hope Institute into the Welcome Project, not just as a partner, but as a fundamental part of our mission?" Anthony's eyes lit up. Helen continued, "You have 50 years of experience in social work. You know the community inside out, and you understand exactly what people here need. We have the resources and structure to transform that knowledge into real action." The tension in the room began to dissipate. Charles quickly jotted down notes on how to incorporate the Institute's expertise into the training programs they were developing. "Perhaps we could form an advisory board," suggested Helen, "with veteran members of the Institute playing an active role in our project's decisions. In addition, We should preserve and share the Institute's history in a dedicated space within the hotel. Helen's proposal not only resolved the impasse, but also added a layer of credibility to the project. The Hope Institute's experience would be essential to avoiding common pitfalls in social initiatives. By the end of the day, as Helen organized the new documents on her desk, she received a text from Richard. "I heard about today's interesting developments. Congratulations on handling it so well. Once again, you've proven why you're the right choice." There was something in his tone that intrigued Helen, as if Richard had known this outcome all along and that every challenge was part of a carefully planned test. That night, riding in the company car, a privilege that still made her feel slightly out of place, Helen passed by the old Dream Inn. The very place where it had all started now looked different, smaller perhaps, but it was there that her life had changed on a rainy night, with one simple act of kindness. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Marina with another project concern. Helen smiled, realizing she was exactly where she was meant to be. Challenges would continue to arise, but now she knew she was capable of facing them head-on. What she did not know was that her greatest test was yet to come, a proposal that would not only test her leadership skills, but also her most deeply held values. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Helen arrived at the office. The project was entering its 6th week, and the walls of the new social hotel were beginning to take shape on the horizon. As she prepared her coffee, she heard the distinctive sound of high heels echoing down the empty corridor. "Helen, so glad you're here," said Beatrice, her normally impassive face now laced with concern. "Ms. Victoria Lancaster is waiting in the conference room." The name made Helen choke on her coffee. Victoria Lancaster, the CEO of Regal Hotels International, was known for her cutthroat business acumen. What could she want now? Inside the conference room, Helen found an elegant woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a pristine Chanel suit. "Miss Walker," Victoria greeted with a cordial smile, extending her perfectly manicured hand. "Your reputation certainly precedes you." Helen managed only a quiet, "My reputation?" "The hospitality market is smaller than you think," Victoria said, motioning for Helen to take a seat. "Your project has been drawing a lot of attention, turning a receptionist into an executive director. Richard has always had a flair for the unexpected." Helen remained silent, waiting for Victoria to reveal the true reason for her visit. And she did not disappoint. "I'll be direct, Miss Walker. I'm here to offer you the position of Chief Operating Officer at Regal Hotels International for the Americas. The package includes a 7-figure starting salary, annual bonuses, stock options, and of course a furnished apartment in any city of your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen's heart pounded, yet she maintained the composure she had learned over these past few weeks. "Why me?" she finally asked. "There are executives with far more experience out there." Victoria's smile was cool and calculated. "Because you possess something no MBA can teach: instinct. In just a few weeks, you've transformed a social project into something that's making the biggest hotel chains question their business models." Helen looked out the window at the workers arriving at the construction site, people who had invested their hopes in the project, and thought of her own journey. "The offer is very tempting," Helen said slowly, choosing her words with care. "But I need time to think." "Of course," Victoria replied, rising gracefully. "You have 48 hours. After that, I'll have to move on to another candidate." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and Helen, please keep this conversation between us. Richard doesn't need to know yet." Once Victoria departed, Helen sank into her chair, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. The salary would solve all her family's financial issues. Her mother could finally retire, and her younger brother could attend the college he'd always dreamed of. But her heart was bound to the Welcome Project and the people it would serve. Then her phone buzzed, a message from Tony at the Hope Institute, sharing photos of enthusiastic young people who had enrolled in the training program. Their hopeful faces made Helen's heart ache with responsibility. Throughout the rest of the day, Helen tried to concentrate on her work, but Victoria's proposal kept intruding into her thoughts. In a team meeting, Marina revealed the final updates for the rooftop community garden, and Charles reported on progress with local partnerships. "Helen, are you all right?" Deborah asked, noticing the faraway look in her eyes. "Yes, I'm just thinking," she replied with a forced smile. At the close of the day, Helen returned to the Dream Inn, the place where it all began. The receptionist from that fateful night recognized her immediately. "Helen, what a wonderful surprise," he exclaimed. "We heard about your success. You're an inspiration to all of us here." Seated in the same spot where she had spent so many long nights working, Helen watched the front door through which Richard had once entered on that stormy night. The decision she made back then had altered her life. Now she stood before another decision that might change everything once more. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Richard. "Tomorrow we have an important meeting with potential investors. Your presence is crucial." Helen glanced at the clock. She now had 36 hours to respond to Victoria Lancaster's offer. 36 hours to choose between financial security and her lifelong purpose. 36 hours to decide what kind of person she truly wanted to be. The investor meeting was set up perfectly. Helen arrived early to review her presentation one last time. Her dark circles a silent testament to the sleepless night spent torn between two very different futures. As she organized her folders on the conference table, she stumbled upon an old newspaper article with the headline, "Future Tech Empire Born from a Social Project." Intrigued, she began to read. The article, dated 15 years earlier, recounted how Richard Morgan had built his first computer program in a community tech center. The center's name made her heart skip a beat. The Hope Institute. "I see you found something interesting," came Richard's voice unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression that was hard to decipher. "Was it all just a coincidence?" Helen asked softly, her voice trembling. "The lot, the institute?" Richard sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the old article. 15 years ago, I was a young coder with nothing but an idea and determination. The Hope Institute gave me more than a space to work. It gave me dignity and purpose." Helen listened, slowly piecing together the puzzle. Richard continued, "When the institute closed, I made a promise to myself. One day I would return that space to the community in an even more impactful way." "So that was your test in hotels," Helen concluded. "You were looking for someone who truly understood the meaning of welcoming others." Richard smiled his enigmatic smile. "And I found more than that. I found someone who, like me, understands the value of an opportunity." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the first investors. Helen carefully tucked the article into her folder as her mind processed the implications of the discovery. The presentation went even better than expected. The investors were impressed by Helen's sustainable business model that combined social impact with financial viability. "But what about the competition?" one investor challenged. "Other hotel chains could copy this model." Helen smiled, thinking of Victoria's offer. "We're not just creating a hotel," she answered confidently. "We're creating a movement. The more social hotels exist, the better it is for everyone." After the meeting, Richard called Helen into his office. "I've heard about the Regal Hotel's proposal," he said, catching her off guard. "Victoria called me last night asking for my blessing to hire you." Helen felt her face grow warm. "I was going to tell you—" "There's no need to explain," Richard interrupted gently. "Difficult decisions are part of the journey. When I received my first multi-million-dollar offer, I was tempted to abandon my social projects as well." "What made you refuse?" Helen asked, curiosity shining in her eyes. Richard grinned wryly. "Who said I refused? I accepted. And it turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. I spent 2 years in a high-paying job that slowly robbed me of my soul. Until one day, looking out the window of my penthouse, I realized I had become exactly the person I once fought against." A lump formed in Helen's throat as Richard continued. "That's when I created Future Tech Inc., with the mission of using technology for social transformation. The money came as a result, not as the objective." At that moment, her phone buzzed, a message from Victoria Lancaster demanding an answer. Helen looked at the screen, then at Richard, and finally out the window where the new social hotel was taking shape. "You know what's funny?" she said, a smile forming on her lips. "Just 24 hours ago, that offer seemed like a dream come true. Now, I realize I'm already living my true dream." Richard nodded, proud. "So, what will you say to Victoria?" Helen picked up her phone, her fingers moving decisively over the screen. Her response would be more than a mere refusal. It would be a statement of her principles, a life choice. What she didn't know was that her decision would trigger a series of events that would not only change her life, but also revolutionize the American hospitality industry. Soon after, on what seemed like a routine morning, while overseeing the installation of solar panels on the roof of the soon-to-be-completed Haven Hotel, Marina burst onto the rooftop with her tablet in hand. "Helen, you need to see this," Marina exclaimed, breathless from climbing 12 flights of stairs. On her screen, a headline from the country's leading news website blared, "Revolutionary Project or Social Marketing? The True Intentions Behind Future Tech's Social Hotel." The article, authored by a respected investigative journalist, questioned several aspects of the project. Anonymous sources suggested that the true goal was to secure multi-million-dollar tax breaks and profit from skyrocketing property values in the area. "How did they learn about the project before the official launch?" Helen asked, her heart pounding as she read through the online comments. The hashtag Facade Hotel was already trending. "Wait, there's more," Marina said, swiping to reveal additional news. Victoria Lancaster gave an exclusive interview, talking about how you turned down a legitimate opportunity to continue with a dubious project. Helen's blood turned cold. Her phone began ringing non-stop. Journalists, project partners, even her worried mother were calling. Amid the chaos, a text from Richard appeared. "Emergency meeting in 30 minutes. In the conference room, the team gathered with tense expressions. Richard maintained his usual calm, though there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. "Have you seen the news?" he began. "We now need to decide how to respond." "Should we sue for defamation?" suggested Deborah, already flipping through her notes. "No," Helen interjected firmly, surprising everyone. "We're not going to fight fire with fire. We'll respond with transparency and results." She strode to the whiteboard and began writing. "Let's move up our planned open house day. We'll invite the press, industry experts, and most importantly, the people who will benefit from this project." Charles Edwards agreed enthusiastically. "I can contact some of the young people already in the training program. Their stories are truly inspiring. And I'll present all the environmental and social impact studies we've completed," added Marina, "including the international certifications we're about to receive." Anthony Foster, representing the Hope Institute, cleared his throat. "If I may, I'd like to add something." From his worn briefcase, he pulled out a yellowed envelope. "These are thank you letters I've kept over the 50 years of the Institute, people whose lives were transformed by our help. Among them," he paused, looking meaningfully at Richard, "is one from a young coder who is now one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs." Richard took the old letter with trembling hands. Helen noticed his eyes glisten as he read the words penned so many years ago. "That's it!" Helen exclaimed as an idea sparked in her mind. "We won't just showcase our project. We'll tell its full story. How it began with the Hope Institute, how Richard came back to give back the opportunity he once received, and how every person involved has their own transformative story." The energy in the room shifted. What had started as a crisis meeting transformed into a strategic planning session. Every team member contributed ideas, turning what could have been a media attack into an opportunity to reveal the project's true essence. "Helen," Richard said quietly as the meeting wrapped up, "you continue to amaze me. Many would have crumbled under this pressure." She smiled, recalling that stormy night at the Dream Inn. "You know what I learned as a receptionist? Sometimes you have to look beyond appearances to find the truth." As the team dispersed to execute their plan, Helen received one more message from an unknown number. Its content sent her heart racing. It contained information that could completely change the course of events and force her to make yet another crucial decision. The message was from Laura Stevens, the journalist behind the controversial article. "I have information you need to see. Meet me at Central Cafe at 7 p.m. Come alone. After a long day spent coordinating the crisis response, Helen nearly ignored the message. But her intuition, the very same that had guided her this far, urged her to go. Central Cafe was a traditional downtown spot frequented by journalists and intellectuals. Helen found Laura seated in a quiet corner, nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Thank you for coming," Laura said in an apologetic tone. "I need to tell you something important about that article." Laura pulled a USB drive from her bag. "I received an anonymous dossier on the project. It looked well researched with documents and everything, but after the article was published, I started getting information that made me question the credibility of the sources." Helen watched as the journalist opened files on her laptop. "Look at this," Laura said, pointing to a document. "These so-called documents about tax benefits, they're fabricated, and I discovered who's behind them." On the screen, an email bearing the logo of Regal Hotels International revealed a deliberate strategy to discredit the Welcome Project even before its official launch. "Victoria Lancaster wasn't acting alone," Laura explained. "There's a group of hotel industry magnates who fear your project will revolutionize the market. They don't want a new standard of social responsibility to take root." Helen felt a mix of anger and sadness. "Why show me this now?" "Because I'm a journalist," Laura replied, closing her laptop. "My job is to uncover the truth, not to be a pawn in corporate games. I'm preparing a new story that will expose all this manipulation, but I thought you deserved to know. First..." Back at the office, Helen found Richard still hard at work, even late into the night. Without a word, she connected the USB drive to his computer and showed him everything Laura had shared. "I'm not surprised," Richard said after several minutes of silence. "But I am disappointed. Victoria and I have worked together before. She knows how important the Hope Institute is in my story." "What do we do now?" Helen asked. Richard smiled, that familiar, knowing smile. "What do you think we should do?" Helen took a deep breath, recalling every lesson from that stormy night. "We stick to our original plan, the open house, transparency, and sharing the true stories. But we add something more." She opened a new presentation on her computer and began typing. "Let's transform this crisis into an even bigger opportunity. Instead of creating just a social hotel, we'll propose a complete transformation in the industry." Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she explained, "We'll develop a certification program for socially responsible hotels, with clear criteria, independent audits, and tangible benefits for society. If other hotels want to copy our idea, fine, but they must do it right." Richard watched with growing admiration as Helen fleshed out the concept. It was far more than a crisis response. It was a complete revolution in how the hospitality sector could impact society. "You know what's even more interesting?" he said, pulling a file from his drawer. "I had a similar idea when I first started this project, but your vision is even more ambitious than mine." Helen worked well into the night, refining the details of the certification program. With every page she wrote, she grew more certain that she was on the right path. The media attack that was meant to destroy the project was about to transform it into something far greater. Yet, as she finalized the proposal, Helen could not imagine that her greatest challenge was still ahead, a revelation that would make her question not only the project, but everything she thought she knew about Richard Morgan and Future Tech Inc. The open house day for the Haven Hotel was scheduled for 1 week away. Helen spent her nights at the office, perfecting every detail of the event that could define not only the hotel's future, but also the future of the American hospitality industry. One evening, while organizing documents in the archive room, Helen discovered an old folder bearing the Hope Institute logo. Inside, amid yellowed newspaper clippings, was a photograph that caught her attention. A group of young people standing in front of the institute, dated 15 years earlier. Among the smiling faces, she immediately recognized a young Richard. But there was more. A gentle-faced woman beside him held a baby. A handwritten caption on the back read, "Hope Institute team with Richard and his sister Teresa, 2010. Helen's heart raced. At no point during the past months had Richard mentioned having a sister. Intrigued, she began digging deeper into the archives. In another folder, she found a newspaper clipping that sent a chill down her spine. The headline read, Tragedy strikes young Coda's family. The article recounted how Teresa Morgan had lost custody of her son after financial hardships led to the baby being placed for adoption. "Some stories are hard to tell," Richard's voice startled her from behind the archive door. He stood there, expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "Why have you never told me about Teresa?" Helen asked, still holding the photograph. Richard slowly sat on a nearby chair. "Teresa was more than just my sister. She was my inspiration. While I was programming, she was busy uplifting people. She volunteered at the Institute, helping single mothers find work." He paused, his eyes lingering on the photo. "When she needed help, I was too busy building my career to notice. By the time I realized the gravity of it all, it was too late." "What happened to her?" Helen asked softly. "Teresa moved to a small town and rebuilt her life, but she never got over the loss of her son. I promised her then that I'd do something to ensure no other family would have to go through the same pain." Richard exhaled slowly. "The Welcome Project isn't just about a social hotel, it's about fulfilling that promise." Helen began to see the true magnitude of the project. It wasn't merely about providing a roof, it was about keeping families together, offering second chances and ultimately transforming lives. "That's why we're emphasizing the professional training program for single mothers," she said thoughtfully. "And the family-friendly apartments." Richard nodded. "But there's more. Teresa's son. He was adopted by a family that frequently stays at Regal hotels." The revelation struck Helen like lightning. "Did Victoria Lancaster know about this?" "I'm not entirely sure," Richard replied, "but I suspect she did. The corporate world can be ruthless when it comes to gaining a competitive edge." Helen rose, her determination solidifying. "We need to revise the open house presentation." In the following hours, Helen and Richard worked tirelessly, adjusting every detail of the project presentation. The focus would no longer be solely on social innovation or sustainability. It would be on real-life transformation, preserving families and building futures. "Before we proceed," Helen said, addressing the team, "I'd like to hear what each of you expects from this project. I don't just want to build a hotel, I want to create something that makes a genuine difference." Marina smiled broadly. "Finally, someone who understands," she exclaimed, opening her folder. "I have ideas to make this space not only functional but truly warm." Hours of discussion ensued. Helen discovered she had a natural ability to unite diverse ideas and people. Her intimate knowledge of hotel operations proved invaluable. She knew exactly which details required the most attention. After the meeting, Richard pulled Helen aside. "I'm impressed," he said quietly. "You exceeded all my expectations today." "Thank you," Helen replied. "But may I ask, why did you choose the Dream Inn for your test?" Richard's eyes softened as he recalled the past. The Dream Inn was more than just a random location. It was the place where our family story began. My parents once owned that hotel. When my father fell ill, we had to sell it. Teresa was only 17 and I was 15. It was our first great loss. The history grew ever more poignant. The Welcome Project wasn't simply a social enterprise, it was Richard's way of reconnecting with his roots and honoring his family's sacrifices. As the open house day approached, the team worked feverishly. Charles had gathered moving testimonials from families who would benefit from the project. Marina put the finishing touches on the rooftop garden, and Deborah prepared the legal framework to ensure the project's longevity. On the eve of the event, Helen received an unexpected visitor at her office, a kindly older woman with gentle eyes that reminded her of Richard. "Mrs. Clara?" Helen gasped in recognition. "What brings you here?" Mrs. Clara, the former housekeeper from the Dream Inn who still worked there, smiled as she produced an old worn notebook from her bag. "I found this while cleaning out the old storage room. I thought you should see it." It was an aged journal with a faded cover. Inside, written in childlike handwriting, was the title Dream Hotel Project by Richard and Teresa Morgan. The yellowed pages contained drawings and scribbled notes from two children with big dreams. Dreams of a hotel where people could not only rest, but rebuild their lives. They spent hours sketching these ideas, Mrs. Clara recalled, her eyes misty with nostalgia. Richard used to say that one day he'd transform our family hotel into something extraordinary. Helen carefully flipped through the pages, astonished to find that many of the ideas mirrored what they were now implementing at the Welcome Project, the community garden, the training rooms, even the integration with the local community. Everything was there, imagined by two children who believed a hotel could change lives. "That's why you chose me," Helen said softly to Richard later that day, showing him the journal. "You saw in me the same compassion that drove those childhood dreams." Richard took the journal with trembling hands. "Teresa and I promised each other we'd never lose our ability to dream, even when life gets hard. This project isn't just mine or yours, Helen. It's the fulfillment of the dream of two children who believed that a hotel could be so much more." On the day of the open house, the Haven Hotel awoke under a radiant sun. The main lobby, with its certified hardwood floors and walls adorned by works from local artists, welcomed its first visitors. Helen, dressed in an elegant navy blue suit, personally oversaw every detail. The press arrived early, including Laura Stevens, who was preparing a special feature on innovative social projects. Victoria Lancaster was also present, though she maintained a discreet distance, watching everything with an unreadable expression. "Helen," Marina called, "she's here." Teresa Morgan, now 45, was even more impressive in person than in old photographs. Retaining the gentle demeanor of her youth from the Hope Institute, her eyes carried a deep, bittersweet melancholy. "Welcome to the Haven Hotel," Helen greeted her warmly, feeling an immediate connection. "It's just like we dreamed in those sketches," Teresa whispered as she looked around, tears glistening. "Richard and I used to imagine every detail." The two women toured the hotel together. Teresa recounted stories from the past that lent new meaning to every element of the project. The rooftop garden had been inspired by the small garden her mother once tended at the Dream Inn, and the training rooms evoked memories of the craft classes she used to teach other mothers. During the tour, a murmur began to spread in the reception area. A young couple had just arrived with a teenager of about 15. Helen noticed Richard tensing at the sight. "They're them," he murmured. "The family that adopted Teresa's son." Time seemed to freeze. Teresa, who was a few steps ahead explaining the community library project to some visitors, had not yet noticed the newcomers. "Do they not know?" Helen asked softly, understanding the delicate nature of the moment. "The adoption process. That was finalized," Richard explained gently. "But the young man, he resembles the little boy Teresa named years ago." Helen observed the teenager, who was fascinated by a display of old photos from the Hope Institute. His eyes, his posture, even his smile, all reminded her of the Mendys, of the family that had started it all. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria Lancaster stepped forward. Her face, once the epitome of corporate competitiveness, now bore genuine emotion. Helen braced herself for another confrontation, but what happened next completely changed the course of events. Victoria stopped in front of Teresa, tears streaming down her usually composed face. "You may not remember me," she said in a trembling voice, "but 15 years ago you changed my life at the Hope Institute." A heavy silence fell over the room as Teresa looked at Victoria, memories surfacing. "You were one of the mothers in the training program," Teresa finally recalled. "You worked as a housekeeper." Victoria nodded discreetly, wiping away her tears. "You encouraged me to study hospitality management. You told me I had the potential to be more than just a housekeeper. I never forgot your words." The story unfolded before everyone. Victoria, before becoming the powerful CEO of Regal Hotels, had once been one of the people helped by the Hope Institute. Her opposition to the Welcome Project was not purely a business maneuver. It was born from fear that her humble beginnings would be exposed. "When I first heard about the project," Victoria confessed, "I panicked. I feared that my past would ruin my reputation. I was a coward. I tried to undermine something that could help so many, just as I was once helped." Gabriel, the adopted son of Teresa, listened intently. His adoptive parents, understanding the moment's gravity, stepped closer to Teresa. "He always knew he was adopted," his adoptive mother said softly. "He always understood that it was an act of love that brought him to us." Perhaps, maybe it's time to complete this story. The following hours were filled with raw emotion and revelations. Gabriel not only learned about his origins, but also about a tale of love, sacrifice and redemption that had defined his very existence. Teresa finally found peace, seeing that the son she loved so dearly had grown into an exceptional young man, nurtured by a loving family. In a gesture that stunned everyone, Victoria Lancaster announced her public support for the Welcome Project. "This hotel isn't a competitor to Regal hotels," she declared to the assembled press. "It's a reminder of our social responsibility, of our shared humanity." The impact was immediate. Other hotel chains, inspired by the story, began expressing interest in joining the certification program Helen had developed. The Welcome Project was no longer just a single hotel, it had become a movement for social transformation. 3 months later, at the official grand opening of the Haven Hotel, Helen looked on with pride at the culmination of all her hard work. The lobby was bustling with both social and paying guests mingling seamlessly, participants in the training programs, and business leaders eager to replicate the model. Teresa now headed the family support program, having found healing in helping others. Gabriel visited regularly, forging a special bond with his biological family without compromising the love of his adoptive parents. In his opening remarks, Richard surprised everyone by announcing that the Haven Hotel would be transformed into a cooperative. "This project was never about one person or one company," he declared. "It's about community, transformation, and welcoming others in the truest sense." Helen, now serving as the cooperative's board president, realized that her journey had grown far beyond a mere career change. That rainy night at the Dream Inn had not been just a test. It was the moment when she unwittingly began writing her own story of transformation. The Haven Hotel would go on to become an internationally studied model, inspiring similar initiatives around the world. Yet its true success wasn't measured by numbers or accolades, but by the everyday lives transformed within its walls. As Helen watched the sunset from the hotel's rooftop garden, now lush and vibrant, she smiled, recalling the words she had once told Richard. "Sometimes you have to look beyond appearances to find the truth." The truth she had discovered was that welcoming someone wasn't just about offering a roof. It was about recognizing the potential in every person, believing in second chances, and understanding that each of us carries a story that deserves to be heard, understood, and celebrated. And so the Haven Hotel stood as a living testament that when we open our hearts to others, we ultimately welcome the best version of ourselves.